Hello there, music fans. This is Music is a Journey, and I'm Peter Scove, and welcome to another episode of the first 10 albums of a particular band. For June 2023, we are taking a look at Uriah Heep, who released their debut album in June of 1970, going way back when now, 53 years ago. That's pretty amazing. I kind of feel like I've been talking about Uriah Heep a lot recently because earlier this year I did a video on the ranking of the albums of Uriah Heep by checking other people's lists and giving an average rank over all those lists. As well, Uriah Heep released their latest album, Chaos and Color, their 25th album, which I also picked up. Also, because of that ranking list, I was inspired to actually check out more albums that I didn't have, and I picked up quite a few. And there were some that I just couldn't get because they were a little bit expensive and difficult to track down. Even getting one in good condition would have to be like an $80, $90 import. But I managed to pick up quite a few more to fatten up my Uriah Heep collection a bit. As well, I think there were just other videos I did this year which included mention of Uriah Heep, such as my video on old bands releasing new albums. Of course, had to mention Uriah Heep in there. And then I even did a little video on songs for rainy days, which included the song Rain by Uriah Heep. And I've also been listening to the Bernie Shaw albums recently and thinking, I wonder if I should do a video about those. So yeah, I really feel like I've got Heep on my mind. But anyway, let's take a look at the history of Uriah Heep going up through the first 10 albums. So we go back to 1967 when Mick Box formed a band called The Stalkers. And they had a vocalist in the band who quit. And the drummer, Roger Pellington, recommended his friend, David Garrick, to be a singer for the band. So David was a little hesitant at first, but he joined. And pretty quickly, Mick Box and David Garrick started forming a songwriting team together, and they realized that their aspirations were greater than what the Stalkers were achieving, and so the both of them, they quit the band and started up a new band called Spice. This would have been around 1968-69. Pretty sure it was around 1969 anyway. So they acquired Alex Napier on drums and also bassist Paul Newton, who had formerly been in a band called The Gods. The Gods? Something like that. And Paul Newton's father took on the management of the band, the manager position of the band. So they worked their way up from doing small clubs all the way up to about the marquee level, which is pretty darn good. And around this time then, Gary Braun, who was a management and production magnate, he heard about the band and came out and checked them out and thought, these guys are pretty good. I think I can do something with them. And so he signed the band to his Hit Production Records and basically took over management of the band from Paul Newton's father. And I think that's pretty fair. You know, Paul Newton's father had worked hard enough to get the band to that level where they could take that next step to a bigger stage, if you will. So the band started to record their first album, Hit Production Records had a connection with Philips, which they started the new Vertigo label, and it was decided that Spice were going to release their debut album on the Vertigo label. However, by the end of 1969, December 1969, marked the 100th anniversary of the death of Charles Dickens. And because Charles Dickens was just everywhere around London at that time, the band decided to go for a name change and choosing a character from the David Copperfield story, a character by the name of Uriah Heep, who always said he was very humble, but who is also a very horrible character. So anyway, they adopted the name Uriah Heep, and also around this time here, David Garrick decided to change his name to David Byron. I think actually that came first before the band name change. So we have Mick Box on guitars, David Byron on vocals, we have Alex Napier on drums, and Paul Newton on bass. So they start recording for their album, and partway through the recording it's decided that they should probably add some keyboards. And Mick Box thought this was a really good idea because he was always a fan of the Vanilla Fudge sound with the heavy keyboards as well as the screeching guitar over top. So he thought that was great. They brought in a guy named Colin Wood to do the keyboards at first as a session player, but then they thought they really should get a permanent player. And so Paul Newton, who had formerly played in the Gods, recommended a guy who had also been in the Gods, a fellow by the name of Ken Hensley, who was at the time playing guitar in a band called Tofat. So Ken Hensley was asked to join the band, and he was suitably impressed and decided, okay, I think I can do something with these guys, and they look like they're going somewhere. So Ken Hensley joined in February of 1970, and basically his task was to re-record some of the keyboard parts, and there were some new songs that were recorded as well. However, his hand in the actual songwriting was rather limited at this point. Anyway, in June of 1970, the debut album was released. Now, depending on the source, I think it's Wikipedia says that it was June 13th. However, the band's official website with the history of the band says it was June 19th. But in any case, we got the album Very Heavy, Very Humble. And interestingly, this is apparently David Byron's face on the cover, covered in cobwebs. I've read several sources saying that's him on the cover, but no one has said how the cover came to be. I suppose there's a story out there on the internet somewhere. Perhaps you know. Anyway, this album here is actually, one of the big heavy albums to come out in 1970. A lot of the credit goes to, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple for their heavy album releases here, but there's some pretty solid heavy material on here. I mean, just listen to Gypsy with that very steady, heavy guitar chord, and also just a really growling, noisy organ solo. There's also some other pretty cool heavy stuff on here. Walking in Your Shadow is not as distorted, but still pretty dark in tones. But there's a lot of other stuff on here too. We've got La Lucy Blues, which is more of a typical blues song. Come Away Melinda. Now that's interesting because the band actually, as Spice, wanted to avoid doing covers, or at least known covers. They wanted to write original material, and if they were going to do any covers, it would have to be something rather obscure. But here they are doing Come Away Melinda, and I never knew it was a cover song, first of all, but I always liked this song ever since I started listening to this album when I was in my, junior high school days back in the mid-'80s. I always loved the song, and I thought it was really very, very touching, the part about the girl finding all the little Melinda girls. There were lots of little girls like you before the war, and then someone in a pretty dress who's all grown up like you. That someone is your mommy you had before the war. And we can understand that Melinda and her father are the only remaining members of her family. Everyone else died during this war that they had. And when it says that someone is your mommy, I always feel like a little bit of a burn in my throat, because, that poor little girl, she lost almost all of her family and only her father remains, thanks to war. So yeah, what is it good for, right? But anyway, one of the big standout tracks on here is, of course, Wake Up, Set Your Sights, which is a little longer track. I don't know, is it 7 or 8 minutes long? It's got more of a kind of like jazzy part in some of it. Some saying that it kind of had a bit more of a King Crimson bent to it, And then, of course, Dream Mare was always one of the ones I really liked, because I love that guitar riff that comes in at the beginning of the song there. And it's one interesting thing to note. While bands like Black Sabbath or even like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple are known for a lot of the great riffs, Uriah Heep doesn't strike me as being a band that does memorable riffs, that people will list as one of the top 10 riffs of all time or something. But Mick Box, he puts a lot of effort, I feel, into the power of the guitar. It's more about the chord rather than the riff, I think, and the power that the guitar gives. But anyway, that is the debut album, and it got kind of a mixed bag of reviews. Some people kind of thinking it's rather interesting, but the most famous review coming from the Rolling Stone, where the author in her review said that if this band makes it, I'll commit suicide. And here we are, 53 years, 25 albums later. I wonder whatever happened to that music critic. So, anyway, I failed to mention that partway through the recording, drummer Alex Napier left the band and was replaced by Nigel Ollie Olsen, who had played on Elton John's debut album. So he finished off the album. That's why there's credits for 2 drummers on that album. However, Elton John's album started to take off, and so Ollie left Uriah Heep, and a fellow by the name of Keith Baker came in to take over the drums. Now, by this time here, the songwriting team of Mick Box, David Byron, and Ken Hensley had become really strong. So in 1971, January 71, we get the release of the second album, Salisbury. This was the very first Uriah Heep album I ever bought. I didn't really know anything about the band. I just knew that they were a heavy band from the early 70s, and I don't know, for whatever reason, I chose this one here. And actually, this remains one of my favorite albums. I particularly liked the song Time to Live, because that is just a straightforward, heavy, pounding rocker with some great lyrics, a great guitar solo, and just really a heavy track. But of course, you also had... well, on here you actually have Bird of Prey as the opening track, whereas on I had the North American release. It had this cover, unlike the American one, which is different, but the opening track on mine was actually High Priestess. And kind of interesting, you know, High Priestess, as the song is going on, like coming towards its conclusion, there are these, like, you know, high, at least I think it's dual vocals anyway, of Byron and Kensley together. They keep coming in like this, ah, you know, while the music is going, and very, very high. And I remember a review, I think it's actually listed on the, this is my second copy of the CD, but the first time I ever bought the CD, I think there was a review quoted inside that said, referred to those vocals as the Danish fjord vocals, because it's the sound you make when you fall into a Danish fjord on a winter day. Interesting that, yeah. So this one here, this has the original British track listing, so starting with Bird of Prey. And then The Park. Now, something about this album that I always liked is, you know, as a teenager in the mid-80s who liked heavy metal, my music was criticized by adults all over, including my parents. Parents, teachers, you know. I had one teacher who was slightly sympathetic because he said he used to play in a Nazareth cover band called Noisereth. But other than that, basically, adults just didn't like heavy metal at all. But I really liked this album because a song like The Park, very beautiful acoustic guitar, it has a kind of like a little bit of a jazzy bit in the middle there. And then, of course, the title track, Salisbury. I know Martin Popoff does not like the song. But I actually like it. And in fact, I like it more these days than I did back then. But you see, like for, you know, my parents who listened to jazz and easy listening, you know, maybe the most aggressive thing they listened to was Tom Jones. And nobody liked my music. But on this album here with Salisbury, you had like the orchestra, you had the horns, you had the flutes and the oboe and everything. And I just thought, like, you know, hey, my guys, my heavy guys can play your music. So don't say that they have no style, no ability, no musical ability. Anyway, that is Salisbury. Also Lady in Black, the song on here that later on became a hit song in Germany back in, I think it was 1977, so several years later. It was one of the 3 Uriah Heep songs to be on the German charts in 77, and also won them some kind of a music award in Germany as well. I actually quite like the album. I know Martin Popoff says it suffers in the production area, and perhaps it is a little dense and less vibrant in places, but overall this has always remained an album that I really enjoyed. So Keith Baker quits Uriah Heep, and they bring in Tony Clark, who had formerly played with Cressida. They go on tour in the US with Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf. Three Dog Night may not have been the best matchup, but Mick Box says that they learned a lot during that tour. And coming back to the UK and back to, was it Lansdowne Studios again? I'm not sure, but they put together the third album, released only a few months after, releasing only several months later anyway, Look at Yourself. Which on the CD here, you don't get the benefit of the reflective cover here, where you're supposed to actually see your kind of distorted reflection in there. But anyway, this album is one of my favorite heavy albums from the 1970s. I often talk about Deep Purple's In Rock being one of my all-time favorite albums. Deep Purple's in rock, though, the sound is a little rough, I find. It's really like the band just played live in the studio with Ian Gillan singing in the box, and not much else is done to it. So it's a really raw sound at times, which I really love. For this album here, Uriah Heep's Look at Yourself, I feel it has that same raw, heavy energy, but it's like they filed the rust off the guitar strings. It's not polished and clean, but it has a more fuller sound, and I really enjoy the sound of this album, and I like all of the songs. Look at Yourself and Love Machine are just two charging, heavy hard rockers. I Want to Be Free, Tears in My Eyes, some really heavy guitar chords in there, but also, you know, strong vocals. We've got July Morning, which is one of the band's signature songs and has been likened to Stairway to Heaven and Child in Time, which, you know, alright, so probably it didn't achieve those levels of fame, but it's where the band was really trying to develop such a kind of epic. And then, of course, Shadows of Grief, which is probably like the evil twin of July Morning. Both of those songs stretching out, I think, around 7 minutes or so. But Shadows of Grief, just, again, showing how Uriah Heep can pound. Man, it's got that, you know, dun, 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 dun. It's heavy, and it's got the really eerie part in there, too. It's cool. Love that track. And then, while everything is basically pretty heavy, we get What Should Be Done, which is the kind of lighter, more pleasant, easygoing track on the album. So overall, excellent album. I love this one. My favorite Uriah Heep album. So coming into 1972, around this time, Ian Clark quits the band, and also Paul Newton finally decides to leave the band. And I seem to remember that he said that he actually really enjoyed his time with the band and was very proud of the work they did, but there were kind of new pressures coming as the band's success increased, and there was that whole thing about his father having formally managed the band and everything being gone over to the to Gary Braun's company. So he quit the band, and that left the opening for now two important members. One, in on drums, they got Lee Kerslake. Now, he had actually been invited to join the band previously, but he had refused. And this time, he was not going to refuse the opportunity. And, of course, Lee Kerslake then became like one of the long-lasting drummers for the band. In fact, I think he's probably played on the most albums out of all of them. And the other person they got in on bass, New Zealander Gary Thane. And by then, 1972, the classic lineup of Uriah Heep was born. And that brings us to Uriah Heep's best loved album. I think even if there are many people who love Look at Yourself, the general view of most is that this album is Uriah Heep's best. Now, I said that Look at Yourself is like as if Deep Purple's In Rock had some of all the rusty roughness filed off. This album here is like where the WD-40 got applied to the strings to clean the rust off completely. It is, in my feeling, not as raw and rough and hard-hitting. The sound has become, though, warmer and fuller, and the band's... I guess this is just really the peak of the band's career in so far as their recording an album goes. So we open with The Wizard. That song, I think, has one of the best acoustic guitar recordings of the 1970s. It's just so good, and the guitar sound throughout the album is really brilliant. Actually, I love The Wizard. I always used to love trying to sing along to it when I was younger. I probably still could try. And Easy Living, of course, probably the biggest, most well-known song, I think, of Uriah Heep, at least in the United States. And then just a lot of other great stuff like Traveler in Time, Circle of Hands. I really love Circle of Hands. It has that really kind of grandiose feel to it and really great guitar sound coupled with the bass there and with the organ. It's really heavy. Then, of course, Rainbow Demon. A lot of people love that one, and it has, again, this a little bit change up in the sound, but then, you know, slow and eerie and, you know, ominous. All My Life, okay, alright, kind of a nice light one there, but I always really liked the pair of Paradise and The Spell at the end, especially The Spell. I just love that part after the long guitar solo where it has the pleasant piano, and then One time the song is, the lyrics are sung through to the same melody that was introduced with the piano, and then like the whole band come in and play that melody one more time through, and then the vocals come back for an even more powerful rendition of that melody. I just loved that whole part there. And again, that's something I always used to like to try to sing when I was alone. I actually tried the other night and I can't do it so well. But anyway, yeah, love this album here. My second favorite, maybe after Look at Yourself, although once again, I do really like Salisbury. But there we go, Roger Dean doing the cover art. Apparently in the cover art here, I think it's at the top, there is a secret vagina hiding in there, and somewhere else in here there is also a secret penis hiding in there. But anyway, there we go. So, the classic lineup now with Mick Box, David Byron, Ken Hensley, Gary Thane, and Lee Kerslake. And they go on the riding on the crest of their success and come out in 1973, isn't it? With The Magician's Birthday. Now, Martin Popoff's review of this is that it's kind of it has its good points, but the production is not as good, and it's just not as focused as Demons and Wizards was. And honestly, while I have always liked this album, listening to it again recently, I thought, yeah, it is, for me, it's like there are some really good songs, and then there are some that are not bad, and then there's one with kind of a big question mark. Sunrise, great. It has like, it feels like a concept album, the opening of a concept album with Sunrise. I really like that. Spider-Woman, okay, as you know, as someone who grew up in the 1970s, Spider-Man was pretty popular, so what the hell is a song about Spider-Woman? I'm sure there's some explanation for it, but just every time I hear it, she was a Spider-Woman, da, 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 da. Okay, whatever, next. Echoes in the Dark and Blind Eye, yeah, pretty good. Rain being one of my favorite. I just love that. It's piano and a little bit of soft organ, and David Byron's vocals for me are just so good on that song. He sings with that kind of loud singing whisper, and he's got the vibrato and just so much feeling in his voice, the way he enunciates the words. I've always loved that song. Sweet Lorraine, great guitar sound. What is that keyboard, that high whistling keyboard? If you're doing a horror movie theme, maybe it works, but I just find it's kind of like, it's not cool. The rest of the song is cool. That high whistling keyboard just doesn't feel cool, you know? Tales, yeah, that actually fits nicely with that Sunrise song. I think also probably with Blind Eye, Echoes in the Dark, Tales. It almost feels like there's half of a concept album on here, you know? And then, of course, we get to The Magician's Birthday, which, aside from the happy birthday with the kazoo part, which I, you know, kind of take for what it is, the rest of the song is really killer in my book. And one of the things I think is that Mick Box doesn't often really show off as a guitar player. Honestly, I can't remember his solos in most of the songs. There's probably about 5 songs, if I stretch, that I remember his solos, and one of them is Salisbury, and another one is The Magician's Birthday. This whole thing here with Mick Box and Lee Kerslake dueling like the good and the bad magician, I think it's really cool. There's just so much exciting, great stuff, and twisted guitar sounds, and the eerie and demented and aggressive guitar sounds, and I love it. So, The Magician's Birthday. Still though, anyway, the band moving along. So here's a Circus magazine issue from November 1973, and an article, Sweet Freedom, Uriah Heep blasts away the demons. This is them leaving their kind of, you know, fantasy and epic themed type songs and going in and writing more of a rock and roll album. Not quite entirely, because Uriah Heep still, I think at this point, we're still doing some of those kind of more epic type heavy prog type pieces, but you know, the opening on this album, Sweet Freedom here, Dreamer, I listened to it again the other day, and it was kind of surprising because you've got guitar, 2 different guitar in left and right channel. The organ is kind of really buried in the back of the right channel somewhere, and the lead guitar, the solo, is in the right channel with the buried scratchy organ, and I just feel like somebody had the channels kind of not right. Still, Stealin', kind of the popular song off the album, and you know, I actually had this many years ago. It failed to impress me. I sold it off, and I picked it up again this year. Pretty good, but you know, 7 stars. I thought, wow, that's a really great song. It's one of the better ones on the album. And then right near the end, there's this A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You know, how does it go? Like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N. It's like, okay, so you're reciting the alphabet as the lyrics of the song. And then the next time he does it, there's like a mixed up version that's kind of repeating in a strange voice in another channel. It's like, come on, guys, the alphabet? Seriously? But I think the final track, Pilgrim, that actually is one of those, you know, more developed songs. It actually has 2 parts to it. It's more grandiose and big. So not, I know this actually ranks, when I did my ranking of the albums of Uriah Heep, their 6th album, Sweet Freedom, came in 6th place as the average rank over, 12 lists that I checked. But, yeah, honestly, of this and the next 3 albums, this is my least favorite of them. But anyway, nevertheless, a highly regarded Uriah Heep album with Sweet Freedom. The next album, however, has a lot of mixed opinion. Uriah Heep's Wonderworld, some people consider this as a very weak effort. I think Martin Popoff said that David Byron's vocals sound like they're lacking confidence. I also find that the organ coming up here on these later albums, starting to sound a little bit like, I don't know, it might be the remastering, but a little bit scratchy, like not scratchy in a good way. Like something was not so good about it. But anyway, honestly, listening to these albums again recently, and I just picked this up a little bit earlier this year, I actually quite like Wonderworld. Suicidal Man is a really cool, hard, heavy rocker, a good example of early heavy metal. Byron giving a scream very much like Ian Gillan near the end of it. The opening track, Wonderworld, shows that kind of more epic Uriah Heep sound with the contrasting with the light and the heavy. And there are a number of other songs in here. I think overall I generally quite like the album, and the print is really small here and I don't remember the track listing. But yeah, the final track, Dreams, and okay, this is embarrassing. I can just see the text, but I cannot actually read the song. Oh, here it is, the Easy Road. Okay, so I'm still not totally familiar with all the tracks on here, but just overall, I actually like this one better than Sweet Freedom, but the general consensus out there is that Sweet Freedom is better. However, this is the album where the problems really start occurring in the band. We have David Byron having heavy drinking problems, and apparently he often drank after the show, but by this album here, he started drinking before the show, and there was a case of him tumbling off the stage or collapsing on the stage at one point. We also had Gary Thane having heroin, I think it was, problems, certainly harsh drug problems, which were getting worse by this time. Much worse. And there's also an incident around this time of Mick Box drinking, and a story about him on the stage kicking a balloon towards the edge of the stage and finally just going right over the stage with the balloon, landing on his guitar and fracturing one of his a radial bone in his arm. Yeah, it sounds like the band was, you know, they'd reached the peak of their success and they were now at that point where things are starting to fracture. As we have seen with most of the bands we've taken a look at so far, somewhere around between the 6th and the 5th and the 8th album, the cracks really start to come through, and it's here by the Wonderworld album. The first casualty from this then was Gary Thane, whose drug problems just got to be too severe, and he was fired from the band, and of course within a year had died of an overdose. So to replace Gary Thane, they brought in John Wetton. Pretty good choice, I think. Wetton, you know, he has the ability to serve as a vocalist. You already have two people doing vocals anyway, so having a third could be pretty cool. As well, he's a really awesome bass player and a writer himself. So they had high hopes for having John Wetton come in and join the band. The resulting album, Return to Fantasy, saw a kind of maybe there was the title track only, but kind of a return. A Year or a Day also, yeah, and Beautiful Dream. Some of these, again, a little bit longer, a little bit darker and heavier Uriah Heep tracks, also with kind of more of a message to them, or maybe light and dark shades kind of thing. But also, you know, Shady Lady, okay, you know, all right, about a guy who, goes home with, like, I guess, basically a prostitute, who then decides that, you know, she doesn't want him to leave in the morning. Whatever. Showdown just being another kind of fun rocker. I don't know. Overall, I think it is a pretty cool album. Maybe I like Wonderworld, then this one, then Sweet Freedom, my personal opinion. But again, they're all kind of, you know, new to me. But overall, I think the three of them make a pretty good set. However, things are getting ugly with the whole situation here. Gary Braun is starting to get more involved with things outside of the band. And that brings us to the 9th album, High and Mighty, which I don't have. I actually did try to get it. It was on an auction, but the price just started going up a little bit too high for me. So the other night I listened to High and Mighty on YouTube, and I gotta say, the sound quality on that YouTube full album thing was really good. And after the first few tracks, I thought, you know, I should actually get this album. It's not as bad as I thought. But the last few tracks, I thought, you know, maybe I don't really need to have it. So, lots of problems there. I heard before that Mick Box was not as involved. Maybe that was the album he was the least involved in. Not really sure, because again, the first few tracks sounds like a Uriah Heep album to me. We did have John Wetton actually sharing lead vocals, or doing most of the lead vocals for the opening track. But production, Gary Braun had apparently not been involved in the production. There was complaints that the production, you know, they were blaming him, Gary Braun, for leaving the band kind of on their own. David Byron was getting more and more difficult with his drinking. Ken Hensley was also becoming difficult because they were saying, like, as a writer, he just felt everything had to be used, and maybe Mick Box or some others thought, we don't need to use everything. We should only pick the good things. But no, it's all good. And things just started fracturing in the band. John Wetton was apparently accidentally electrocuted on stage. This had actually happened to Gary Thane before as well. And just the whole circus of everything going on. John Byron was finally fired from the band, and John Wetton just thought, like, okay, it's not really what I signed up for. The politics in the band are just too messy. Mick Box says it was more of a question of personalities, like he didn't gel well with the rest of the band. But I mean, basically the band was really starting to implode or explode, whatever, come apart at the seams at this point, and change was inevitable. Interestingly, and maybe ironically, or maybe not ironically, there is a song on the album called Can't Keep a Good Band Down, and the chorus goes, you can't keep a good band down, you'll never find a solution, you'll never stop us running around, you're dealing with an institution. And I guess in a way it makes sense, because yeah, you'll never stop us running around, but yes, David Byron, you're out, and John Wetton, you're gone after this album here. But it's true that Uriah Heep continued. Mick Box, Ken Hensley, Lee Kerslake, bringing in new members. So Trevor Boulder coming in on bass, formerly of David Bowie's Spiders from Mars band, and John Lawton coming in to take over the vocals. John Lawton, of course, previously of Lucifer's Friend, a very heavy rock outfit out of Germany. Heavy rock going to progressive rock, I think. And the Humphrey Singers. I have no idea what that is. Now, David Byron was apparently really a great charismatic character on the stage. He just really knew how to work the audience. John Lawton didn't look as cool. One article I read somewhere, he just didn't have the funnest hair. I think it was probably similar to mine. A little bit kind of like flat and thin on top, but puffy on the sides. But man, can that guy sing. And they thought, now with that voice, we can continue. And of course, Uriah Heep then put out their 10th album in 1977, Firefly, featuring the new lineup with Trevor Bolder on bass and John Lawton on vocals. And that lineup there, those 5 guys, would go on to produce 3 albums together. But that takes us a little bit beyond what we're looking at here. The 10th album by Uriah Heep, is where we will stop. And before we come to a complete halt, let's just take a look at the tracks. The Hanging Tree, pretty good. You know, I always kind of liked this album. I had it on cassette in the 80s and on CD again. It's a nice Uriah Heep album. It's got a blend of more harder rocking tracks, you know, more the guitar distortion. Again, you've got a song like Wise Man or Sympathy, a little bit more on the slower side. Rolling On, a good, you know, rocker. And then you've got Firefly, which is kind of one of those Uriah Heep epic things. It has the kind of really slow part, goes into a rockin' part, goes into a different kind of little more up-tempo slow part, a little slight friendly thing. Kind of reminds me almost of a TV gum commercial or something from those days, and then returns to the beginning part. The only thing I'm kind of disappointed is that when it returns to the beginning, they just like fade it out after that, like, and now we're back to the start, we can finish. Well, maybe you could have developed it a little bit longer, you know. But overall, I'd say it's pretty good. Until I heard Fallen Angel, I actually thought this is probably my favorite of the John Lawton albums, because I'm not so keen on Innocent Victim, but actually Fallen Angel I think I might just like a little bit better than this one. But anyway, Uriah Heep's Firefly. So here also we should take a look at what happened with the band. You know, they rose to probably their peak somewhere around recording wise with Demons and Wizards. Sales wise, apparently Return to Fantasy was their highest album on the charts with regards to sales, going up to number 7, although I didn't actually find out what chart that was. But then after that, you know, with the band starting to break apart, the loss of Gary Thane, kicking him out, and then firing David Byron and John Wetton, you know, wandering off, not wanting to be part of the whole thing, tension between them and the management, the band, you know, went off that really high point. And so by the time they were out with Firefly, they actually became an opening act. And they opened for Kiss. But the interesting thing, I think it was Paul Stanley, he had some very favorable comments to say. He said, their worst nights were great, and their best nights were tremendous. It's also interesting, I want to throw this in here, that on Rush's first tour of the US, Rush opened for Uriah Heep. And, of course, later on, when Uriah Heep were kind of on the way down, they actually opened for Rush. But anyway, that takes us through the first 10 albums of Uriah Heep. I am liking this band more and more. I've always liked them since the 1980s, just for those first 5 albums. Recently, I'm finding I'm liking them more and more and finding their music more and more interesting. I probably don't need to get every album, and some of the ones I want are a little bit expensive to get a hold of now. But I think I have 19 of the 25 albums, and that covers a pretty decent selection of music. So anyway, we're going to wrap that up here with Uriah Heep, and thank you all for watching. Feel free to leave any comments. I'm always glad for those. Give me a like. I don't know why I never tell people to do this, but, you know, give it a like. Come on. All right, and we'll catch you in another video sometime in the near future. Thank you all for watching. Have a good week.